In this video, we are going to be talking about how to spice up your one chord or your tonic chord. So if you're in the key of C major, your C major chord. If you're in the key of A minor, your A minor chord. We're going to use the key of C today to keep things super simple, but let's talk about how we can make our one chord, our tonic chord, a little more interesting. So one way to make our tonic chord more interesting is simply by changing the inversion of it. So what changing the inversion really means is whatever the lowest note is. Sometimes we think of inversions just sort of in, especially if you're a pianist, in the sense of this would be just root position, this would be first inversion. But technically, even if I play this, which that form itself is first inversion, if I have a G in the bass, it's actually that lowest bass note that determines what inversion your chord is. So let's look at first inversion first. That would be if we're in the key of C major and we're utilizing a C major chord because that is the tonic chord in C major or the one chord, we would have an E in the bass. Now, something that I find this gives you is it really takes away the whole resolved sound that you normally would expect from a tonic chord. So if we're playing in C major and then we resolve to a chord that is a traditional C major chord that's in root position, it sounds super resolved. But just by changing it so that we have an E in the bass or first inversion, it sounds way, way less resolved. So just as a frame of reference, we'll use a basic 1-5-6-4 just because we all know the sound of it. To keep it simple, it will sound very resolved when we utilize our tonic chord with a C in the bass. Sounds very resolved, right? But compare that to that does not sound very resolved. In fact, at least to my ears, whenever you have first inversion, it really sounds to me like it wants to go to that 4 chord. And I think the reason for that is largely because it's a really effective leading tone, because it is one of only 2 half steps that we would have in a major key, right? So in C major, the only half steps we have are between E and F and B and C. So B to C would be your traditional leading tone, your 7 to your 8. But also, it's a very effective leading tone to have our 3 to 4 because that also is a semitone. So anyway, if you really want to have a one chord that doesn't sound resolved and doesn't sound like, oh, this is the main point or this is the beginning of the chorus, really just changing up the inversion, specifically to first inversion, can be a great way to transition from that one chord to a 4 chord in a way that that one chord doesn't sound so highlighted or so resolved. Compared to. So another way to make your one chord not sound so resolved and make it a little more interesting is by simply changing it to second inversion, which if first inversion utilizes the second note in the chord rather than the root note as your bass note, then second inversion uses that third note of your triad. So for a C major chord, which is C, E, and G, root position has C in the bass, which is what you see most often. First inversion would be E in the bass, which we talked about. And then second inversion would be with the G in the bass. Now this also is going to sound way less resolved than when you have just a C in the bass. So that sounds super resolved, but just by changing it to having the G in the bass, it sounds way less resolved. And specifically, we talked about, at least to my ears, that often when you utilize the first inversion with the third in the bass, it really sounds like it wants to go up to an F major chord. To my ears, when you use a second inversion chord, very often it sounds like it just wants to go to the 5 chord, and that's because the 5 chord shares that bass note. So this, to me, sounds like it wants to resolve to just a G major chord, or you could elongate that by going C major with G in the bass, and then you actually have your G sus chord, which then resolves to a regular G major triad. And then that's a great way to sort of elongate a, hey, I want to add tension, and then eventually get that great resolution that you get from going from 5 to 1, because the 5 chord is the chord that most badly wants to resolve to the 1. So especially if you're at the end of the song and you want to have sort of a almost overdramatic transition from sort of that end part of your song into, hey, the final chord of the song that sounds super resolved. A great way to do that is you do the 1 chord, but with the 5 in the bass, and then you go to that sus chord, which is your 5 sus chord, which in C major would be a G sus chord, and then a regular G major chord, which then really wants to resolve to that 1 chord. So another way to make your tonic chord, your 1 chord, more interesting is by utilizing a sus2 chord. So why I personally really love utilizing the tonic sus2 chord is that is one of the most adaptable, easy to play chords. It's a great way that if you want to have a whole song that just utilizes that sus2 chord and you just change the bass note, you can actually get a whole bunch of really different, interesting chords almost for free just by changing the bass note. Let's talk about why this is. So if we take that C sus2 chord, which means that we don't have the 3rd in the chord, but we do have the 2nd in the chord. So we have C, D, and G. Another way to look at this is it's sort of like a C5 chord or a C power chord for those of you who are guitarists, because a power chord is always just that 5th. I shouldn't say always. The vast majority of power chords are that. And then you also have that D. So if we change where that D is on the keyboard, it can really start to illustrate what we're going for. So we have that. You may notice that that is a C5 chord, or in the context of C major, just our C power chord basically, or a C5 chord. But then also G to D is basically a G power chord or a G5 chord. So one way to see a C sus2 chord in the context of C major is that it's sort of like you are implying both the 1 chord and the 5 chord at the same time, which makes it super adaptable because those are 2 of probably the most common chords in a song. But it's also very open sounding because it doesn't have any 3rd, right? It just has the 1st and the 5th of both your C chord and your G chord, your 1 chord and your 5 chord. So simply by changing the bass note, this can really affect what the chord sounds like it actually is. So for example, if we have a C in the bass, to keep it really simple, then it just sounds like a C sus2 chord. But if we have a B in the bass, now all of a sudden we have B, D, and G with a C. So we have a full G major triad because we have G, your 1st, and then your 3rd in B, but it's in the bass, and then D, which is your 5th, which is not in the bass in this instance. But then you have an added C. So it's basically a G major add 4 chord. Then if we change the bass note to an A, now it's sort of implying a minor 7th chord because it has that G from the 7th, and it has A and E, which forms that minor 3rd of the A minor triad. And then we don't have that 5th, but ultimately that's not necessarily a huge deal. It's pretty common actually for chords to leave out that 5th. I shouldn't say pretty common, but it happens fairly often. Because it has every other note of it, it still heavily implies that A minor sound. That and whatever note is in your bass is always usually going to win out in a tie break for what the chord sounds like it actually is. But then we have that D, which would be an added 4. So it's sort of like an A minor 7th add 4 chord. And again, this is keeping the same shape in my right hand here, where we're just using that C sus2 and we're just changing the bass note. So you can do this the same way by playing a C sus2 chord, or whatever key you're in, just the 1 chord sus2 with your guitar, and then the bass is just playing different bass notes. So then we could go on, for example, if we put a G in the bass, now it's basically just implying a G sus4 chord. And then if we have an F in the bass, starting to get a little more spicy because now there's a lot of questions about what this is really implying. Because you have the 1st and the 5th of an F major triad, but we don't have that A anywhere. But instead we have a D, which is like an added 6th, and then a G, which is like an added 2. So that is getting especially interesting as a chord. And again, this is just changing up what note is in the bass. So a sus2 chord for your tonic chord is a great way to be able to really easily create some interesting chords and harmonies simply by changing the bass note. So then, of course, we have to talk about a 7th chord. This is a really simple way to spice up any chord, is just making it a 7th chord. So in the context of C major, that would be adding that B note. And a part of what makes this inherently interesting is that it's going to always add that little bit of tension. And the reason for that is because we're using the leading tone of the entire key. We're utilizing a B, which really badly wants to resolve to the C because that's our tonic. That's our main home bass. And it just really wants to resolve from this to this. So that's always going to be adding that little bit of tension that will make our chords more interesting. And of course, you can do different inversions of it, like this, which then has that B as the low part of what's being played in my right hand. So 7th chord is just an easy way to spice up any chord, really, but specifically your 1 chord, if you want to give it a little bit more tension than it normally would have, because normally your 1 chord is going to sound ultra resolved. Of course, you can do some of the other things we talked about, but you also can just make it a 7th chord, which is going to have some built-in tension. And lastly, we'll talk about a sus4 chord. The sus4 chord specifically can be a really great way if you are on that tonic chord, if you're on that 1 chord for a long period of time, but you don't want it to get musically boring, simply throwing in a sus4 chord for a bit and then reverting back to that main triad, your just basic C major chord in the context of C major, can be a great way to actually keep it interesting. So just for frame of reference, if we're just on C major for a while, this is going to start to get boring. Now, maybe because of your melody or other things you're trying to do with your song, you may actually want to stay basically on your 1 chord for a long time. And a great easy way to just spice it up is just by throwing in some of those sus4s. So going from or for example, maybe after you sing a phrase and you no longer need that third, that E for your harmony to really support your melody. You know, you sing a phrase and then you go back to your next phrase or something like that. It can just be a really simple way to mix it up and make it so that even though you're staying on that tonic chord for a long time, if you want to make it so that it's a little less boring, you can simply do that. Of course, you can do it with arpeggiated things too. And of course, you can combine it with some of the other things we talked about too, right? So that's just C major, right? That's with a G in the bass. And that's F in the bass and the sus4. So again, just as a really quick recap, one thing you can do is simply change the note that you have in the bass. Instead of your normal tonic 1 root position chord, you can instead change it to utilize the 3rd of the chord in the bass or the 5th of the chord in the bass, and those will get you some less resolved, more interesting sounds. You also can utilize a sus2, which I personally really love because you sort of could look at it as playing the dyad of your 1 chord and your 5 chord at the same time. Now, normally you wouldn't think of it that way, but it can be helpful to think of it that way when it comes to thinking through what the chord really is doing harmonically, and is just a different way of looking at it. But that would just be utilizing your regular sus2 chord. Then you can utilize a sus4 chord, especially if you want to sort of stay on the 1 chord for a while, but you want to add a little flair to it without changing the harmony up too much. That can be a great way to do that. And then, of course, a 7th chord, which is really just a great way to spice up any chord. But those are some great ways to make your 1 chord more interesting, especially if you're in a position where what you're trying to do is utilize the 1 chord. You want the 1 chord for what it provides harmonically to support your melody, but you really don't want it to sound resolved. Maybe it's like the 3rd chord in your 4 chord progression. It's not a part of the song that you want to highlight and really make it sound like, oh, this is the main point. One great way to make it really easy to make your one chord not sound like a highlight, not sound like, boom, this is home, this is the main point, is really just by doing one of these things, especially just changing up the inversion can be a great way to do that. Hopefully this was helpful to you. If it was, something else you may find helpful is my free guide on the 4 pillars of music theory that I think every songwriter really needs to know. There's a lot of music theory that is helpful. In fact, I would argue almost all music theory is helpful to songwriting, but I really think there's only 4 things that are absolute pillars that everybody needs to know in order to be more efficient and effective at songwriting. Those things are intervals, keys, chords, and chord progressions. So I teach those 4 things in that free guide. It's at songwritertheory.com/music theory guide. Be sure to check that out. Thank you for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.